In the dusty town of Silver Creek, nestled between rugged mountains and open plains, lived a cowboy named Jack Tanner. His life, like the land he worked on, was simple but hard. Jack was known throughout the small town as a strong and quiet man, a man who had worked the ranch for as long as anyone could remember. With his broad shoulders, worn boots, and a hat that shaded his sharp blue eyes, he looked like someone who had seen everything the Wild West had to offer. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, Jack was already up and out on his horse. The work was tough, moving cattle, fixing fences, and tending to the needs of the ranch. He was a man of few words, preferring the quiet of nature to the noise of crowds. The other cowboys on the ranch admired him for his skill and work ethic, but they also knew there was more to Jack than met the eye. Beneath the calm, rugged exterior was a man who rarely let anyone close to him. Jack didn't have many friends, but the ones he did have trusted him completely. He wasn't one for small talk or jokes. He was serious, focused, and to most people a mystery. Silver Creek was a town where everyone knew everyone, and the gossip spread fast. It was a town where things were simple, but there were always whispers about those who didn't fit in, the ones who were different. And in this town, Jack Tanner was about to find out what it was like to be the center of a joke. One evening at the local saloon, Jack sat at his usual spot at the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey. He wasn't in the mood for conversation as usual. The sound of clinking glasses and low chatter filled the air. Jack preferred the silence of the night, but tonight something felt different. His friends, a group of cowboys who worked at nearby ranches, were gathered around the table, laughing and talking louder than usual. Jack didn't pay them much attention at first, but the more they laughed, the more he could feel their eyes on him. He wasn't a fool. He knew they were up to something. It wasn't long before one of them, a man named Tom, got up from the table and walked over to Jack. Tom was the kind of guy who liked to stir the pot, always looking for ways to get a rise out of people. "Hey, Jack," Tom said with a grin. "We've got a little surprise for you." Jack raised an eyebrow, setting his glass down. He was used to Tom's tricks by now, but there was something about the way he was acting that made Jack curious. "I don't need any surprises," Jack replied, his voice low. "Oh, it's nothing big," Tom said, still smiling. "Just a little fun. You know, something to liven things up around here." Jack looked around at the other men who were now watching him closely. They all had that look in their eyes, the kind of look that meant trouble was brewing. "All right, what's going on?" Jack asked, his patience thinning. "Well, Jack," Tom continued, "you've been so focused on your work out there on the ranch, we thought maybe you could use a little distraction, a change of pace. So we got you something special." Before Jack could ask what Tom meant, a young woman appeared at the door of the saloon. She was slender, with dark hair and wide, curious eyes that looked out of place in the rowdy, rough atmosphere of the bar. Her skin was fair, and she wore simple clothes that looked foreign in this western town. The moment Jack saw her, he felt a jolt of surprise. He had never seen anyone like her before. She was clearly not from around here. Tom chuckled as he saw Jack's confused expression. "This here's Mei Ling," he said, his voice full of amusement. "She's come from China. We thought you might like to have her around the ranch. Maybe teach you a thing or two about life in a way that's not so plain." Jack was taken aback. He didn't know what to say. He looked at the woman, Mei Ling, who seemed just as confused as he was. She didn't speak, but the look on her face was one of uncertainty, as if she didn't know what was happening either. "This is a joke, right?" Jack said, standing up slowly. He wasn't sure if he should laugh or feel insulted. His friends had pulled pranks before, but this one was different. Tom just laughed. "Oh, come on, Jack, you've been working too hard. A little company wouldn't hurt. We figured we'd give you something to lighten up your day." Jack wasn't sure how to respond. He glanced at Mei Ling again. She was standing still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, but there was a sense of quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. She didn't look like someone who deserved to be the center of a joke, even if she had been sent here as one. Jack took a deep breath and turned to Tom. "I'm not in the mood for your games," he said firmly. "You want to make a joke, go ahead. But don't bring anyone else into it." Tom waved him off, still laughing. All right. We'll let you handle it, Jack. But just remember, you might find her useful. She can help with some of the work around the ranch." Jack wasn't sure what to think. Mei Ling had been thrust into a situation she clearly wasn't prepared for. He could see that now. She wasn't there by choice, she was part of a prank, and Jack had to decide what to do next. With a quiet nod, Jack motioned for Mei Ling to follow him outside. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but he knew he couldn't let her stay in the saloon like that, especially with people laughing at her behind her back. As they stepped outside, Jack's mind raced. He wasn't sure what kind of woman Mei Ling was or why she had come to this strange land, but he could see she was no different than anyone else trying to survive. This wasn't her fault. He might not have wanted to be the center of a joke, but he wasn't going to let anyone else suffer because of it. "I'm sorry about all this," Jack said as they walked toward the ranch. "I didn't expect this either." Mei Ling looked at him, her expression softening. "It's all right," she said quietly in broken English. "I understand. I know it's not your fault." And in that moment, Jack realized that the joke had just started, but it was about to take a turn he hadn't expected. This woman, this stranger, was going to change everything. Jack Tanner led Mei Ling down the dusty road toward his ranch, unsure of what to say or how to make her feel welcome. The night air was cool and the stars above twinkled in the vast dark sky, but Jack's mind was elsewhere. He had always been a man of action, quick with his hands and strong in his work, but when it came to handling people, especially strangers, he wasn't so sure of himself. Mei Ling, on the other hand, walked beside him quietly, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She seemed calm, almost too calm for someone who had just been thrust into such a strange situation. Her soft footsteps barely made a sound as they walked, and Jack couldn't help but notice how different she was from anyone he had ever met. She had arrived in Silver Creek only a few days ago, a long way from her home in China, and already, her presence had caused ripples in the small town. Most of the townspeople had looked at her with curiosity, some with confusion, but Jack had never been one to judge a person by where they came from. Still, this situation felt awkward. She was here because of a joke, not because she wanted to be. "I'm sorry about what happened back there," Jack said after a long silence. His voice was rough, like it always was after a long day. "Those men, they think it's funny, but they don't always understand the consequences." Mei Ling glanced up at him. Her expression was calm, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "It's all right," she said quietly. "I am used to strange situations." Her accent was soft and her English was broken, but Jack could understand her just fine. They walked on in silence for a few moments, each lost in their thoughts. The sound of crickets filled the air and the wind rustled the dry grass at the side of the road. The ranch wasn't far now, just a short walk from the town, but Jack wasn't sure how he was going to explain this situation to her. When they finally reached the ranch, Jack led Mei Ling inside the small, modest house. The inside was simple, with rough wooden floors and a few pieces of furniture. Nothing fancy, but it was home. The warm glow of the fire in the fireplace made the room feel more inviting, and Jack motioned for Mei Ling to sit down at the small table. "I can show you where you'll be staying," Jack said, his tone more relaxed now that they were away from the prying eyes of the saloon. "There's a small room near the barn. You can stay there until you figure out your next move." Mei Ling nodded. She didn't seem upset or scared, but there was a quiet strength in her that Jack admired. She was a stranger in a strange land, and yet she wasn't running away. She was facing whatever came her way with dignity. "Thank you," Mei Ling said softly, looking around the room. "I will work hard. I can cook, clean. I can help." Jack glanced at her, a little surprised by her calmness. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," he said, trying to make her feel comfortable. "I don't know what the other men were thinking, but I won't ask you to do something just because they said so." Mei Ling smiled slightly, her eyes brightening a little. "I don't mind," she said. "I came to America to work." "To learn," Jack nodded. He didn't understand everything about her situation, but he could see she wasn't looking for a handout. She wasn't here to be the subject of anyone's jokes. She was here to build a life for herself, just like everyone else in Silver Creek. The next morning, Jack went out to check on the cattle. Mei Ling, having settled into the room Jack had shown her, quietly prepared breakfast. She had a gentle way of moving around the kitchen, and Jack noticed she worked efficiently, as if she had done this many times before. She didn't speak much at first, but when Jack came in for breakfast, she greeted him with a warm smile and a soft, "Good morning." She had prepared a dish that Jack didn't recognize, steamed rice with vegetables and a few herbs. At first, Jack was unsure about the food. It was so different from the heavy, meat-filled meals he was used to. But the smell was inviting, and he didn't want to seem rude. He took a small bite, then another. To his surprise, it was delicious, flavorful, and refreshing, not what he expected at all. He looked at Mei Ling, who was watching him with quiet interest, as though waiting for his reaction. "This is good," Jack said, nodding. "I didn't expect it to taste like this." Mei Ling smiled, a soft and genuine smile that made her look even more beautiful in Jack's eyes. "It is a simple dish," she said, her English a little clearer now. "But it is good for health. I learned to cook from my mother." Jack sat back in his chair, chewing thoughtfully. "Well, I don't know about health," he said with a chuckle. "But it sure tastes good." The rest of the morning passed in a quiet routine. Mei Ling worked around the house, cleaning and organizing, while Jack took care of the ranch duties. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt natural somehow. Jack was used to working alone, and Mei Ling didn't seem to mind the quiet either. But as the days passed, Jack began to notice something about her. There was a wisdom in her eyes, something deeper than he expected. She didn't seem like the kind of person to just sit around and wait for life to happen. She was always working, always looking for something to do, whether it was tending to the small garden by the barn or organizing the tools in the shed. One afternoon, as Jack worked with the cattle, Mei Ling came outside with a basket of freshly picked herbs. She stood quietly at the fence, watching him. Jack glanced up, and for the first time he noticed the way she watched him. Not with the usual curiosity, but with an understanding that made him feel uneasy. "Jack," Mei Ling said, her voice carrying softly over the wind. "Why do you work so hard?" Jack stopped and turned to look at her. He wasn't sure how to answer the question. It wasn't the kind of thing people asked around here. Hard work was just part of life. You did what you had to do to survive. But Mei Ling's question felt different, I guess. "It's just what you do," Jack replied, feeling a little uncomfortable under her gaze. "You don't have much choice. It's the way things are." She nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, but is it the only way?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the cattle and went about his work. But Mei Ling's question stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after she had gone inside. Days turned into weeks, and as Jack worked alongside Mei Ling, a bond began to form between them, though neither of them was quite sure how it had happened. At first, it was all about the daily chores, feeding the animals, cleaning the barn, preparing meals, but over time, something shifted. Jack had never imagined that a simple woman from China, a woman who had been sent to his ranch as part of a joke, could make such a difference in his life. One warm evening, after a long day spent working under the sun, Jack sat outside on the porch, his legs stretched out and his hat tilted down over his eyes. The sky had turned a soft orange as the sun set behind the hills, and the sounds of the evening, crickets chirping, the wind rustling the leaves made the moment feel peaceful. Jack had always enjoyed the silence. It gave him time to think. But tonight his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Mei Ling walking toward him, a small basket of herbs in her hand. She had been gathering them from the garden, as she often did, and Jack couldn't help but notice the way the fading sunlight made her look even more delicate, almost ethereal. Mei Ling stopped a few feet away from Jack and smiled at him gently. "Jack," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The moon looks beautiful tonight, don't you think?" Jack blinked, a little surprised by her words. It wasn't often that someone stopped to appreciate the small things, especially in a place like this where hard work took up most of their time. He glanced up at the sky where the moon was just beginning to rise, casting a silvery light over the land. "Yeah, it's a nice view," he said, his voice rough as it always was after a long day. There was a quiet moment before Mei Ling spoke again. "Where I come from, we believe that the moon can show you the truth," she said, looking up at the sky. "It's said that if you look at it long enough, you'll understand things that you didn't before." Jack raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the idea. "Is that so?" he asked, sitting up straighter. "And what do you see when you look at it?" Mei Ling hesitated as if she wasn't sure how to answer. She placed the basket of herbs down next to her and sat down beside Jack on the porch. "I see everything," she said quietly. "I see how people live, how they work, how they struggle, and I see the things they don't say, the things they hide. Jack was silent for a moment, considering her words. It was hard for him to open up, to talk about feelings or things that weren't immediately visible. He wasn't the kind of man who shared his innermost thoughts with others. But something about Mei Ling made him want to. "I don't know about all that," Jack said, leaning back in his chair. "But I do know that life around here is hard. We don't have time for much else. We work, we survive, and we keep going." Mei Ling nodded slowly. "I understand that," she said. "But sometimes, Jack, it feels like you're running. Running from something. Maybe from yourself." Her words hit him like a stone thrown into calm water. Jack didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to having someone point out things he had been avoiding for years. He'd spent so much time working, trying to prove his worth, that he'd never stopped to think about what he was truly running from. "What do you mean?" Jack asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the answer. Mei Ling turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face with a kind of quiet understanding that made him feel exposed. "You work so hard, Jack, but you never seem happy. You never let anyone get close. You hide behind your work, behind your silence. But I think maybe you're afraid." Jack swallowed, his throat tight. He wasn't used to being read so easily. "Afraid?" he repeated. He let out a short laugh, but it didn't sound natural. "I'm not afraid of anything." Mei Ling's gaze softened, but she didn't back away from her words. "Maybe not of anything outside of yourself, but I think you're afraid of what might happen if you stop working, if you let yourself feel something other than tired." Jack's heart raced. She was right. In a way, he had always feared what would happen if he allowed himself to slow down, to feel the things he had buried deep inside. He had been running from his past for so long that he had forgotten how to face it. For a long time, Jack didn't speak. He simply stared out into the distance, the weight of Mei Ling's words pressing down on him. He didn't know how to answer her, didn't know what to say to someone who could see through him so clearly. After a while, Mei Ling spoke again, her voice quieter now. "You don't have to be afraid, Jack. You don't have to do everything alone. You don't have to hide from what's inside of you." Jack looked at her, his chest tight. She wasn't judging him, wasn't criticizing him. She was simply understanding him. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like someone saw him, not just the cowboy with the rough hands and the worn hat, but the man beneath it all, a man who had been carrying burdens alone for too long. "I don't know how to change," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to change all at once," Mei Ling replied, her voice steady. "Change can happen in small steps, but you have to allow it. You have to trust yourself." Jack sat there for a long time, letting her words sink in. He had never been one to trust easily, but something about Mei Ling made him want to. She wasn't asking him to become someone else. She was simply asking him to let go of the things that held him back. The moon continued to rise, casting its soft light on the land around them. Jack looked up at it again, feeling a strange sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. Maybe Mei Ling was right. Maybe there was more to life than just working and surviving. Maybe it was time to stop running. As the night deepened, Jack finally spoke again, his voice low but clear. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time I stopped running." Mei Ling smiled softly, and for the first time, Jack felt like he was looking at the person he was meant to be, not the one he had tried so hard to be. And in that moment, he realized that this strange, quiet woman from China had come into his life for a reason. She had made him see something he had never noticed before, something that was waiting for him all along. The days that followed Jack's conversation with Mei Ling were different. Something had shifted within him, something he couldn't quite explain, but it was there, quietly changing the way he saw his world. The endless work on the ranch, which once felt like a heavy burden, started to feel more like a shared purpose. Mei Ling, despite being so different from everyone Jack had ever known, became a steady presence in his life. Her quiet strength, her wisdom, and the gentle way she saw the world began to make a deep impression on him. At first, Jack had been wary of allowing someone into his life, someone so foreign, someone so out of place in a town like Silver Creek. He had been content with his solitude, and the thought of a stranger living in his house, even if only for a short time, seemed uncomfortable. But Mei Ling, with her calm demeanor and her ability to understand things Jack couldn't always put into words, made the discomfort fade away. They began to spend more time together, though their conversations remained simple. Jack would work the fields or tend to the animals, while Mei Ling would go about her tasks around the ranch. She never seemed to rush, always taking her time, whether it was preparing meals or tending to the small garden she had started near the barn. Jack had never cared much for gardening, but he found himself fascinated by the way she could make even the smallest seed grow into something beautiful. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Jack sat on the porch, watching the cattle in the distance. The ranch was quieter than usual, the kind of peaceful quiet that followed a hard day's work. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed such moments until now. Mei Ling came out to join him, holding a basket of fresh herbs she had picked from the garden. "Looks like another good day," Jack said, tipping his hat back and glancing at the sky, which was now painted with soft shades of pink and orange. Mei Ling sat down beside him, offering the basket. "I made some tea," she said. "It's good for the mind and body. Would you like some?" Jack had never been much for tea, but something about the way she offered it made him smile. "I suppose it couldn't hurt to try," he said with a grin. Mei Ling poured the tea into 2 small cups, handing one to Jack. She smiled quietly, watching as he took a sip. To his surprise, the tea was warm and soothing, with a flavor he couldn't quite place but found comforting. "This is good," Jack said, his voice softer than usual. "What's in it?" Mei Ling chuckled softly. "A few herbs from the garden. It's a simple blend, nothing fancy, just nature's way of helping." Jack nodded, taking another sip. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down, and he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He realized that despite everything that had happened, the prank that had brought Mei Ling here, the awkwardness, the tension, he had come to look forward to these quiet moments with her. After a while, Mei Ling spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "You know, Jack, when I first came to this country, I thought everything would be different. I thought I would find work easily, that I would quickly build a new life. But it wasn't that simple." Jack turned his head to look at her. There was a sadness in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't the kind of sadness that cried out for attention, but the kind that quietly lingered just beneath the surface. "America's not as easy as people think," Mei Ling continued, her voice steady. "There's a lot of work, but there's also a lot of loneliness, a lot of misunderstanding. People here are quick to judge, quick to see what's different instead of what's the same." Jack listened closely, unsure of what to say. He had never really thought about what Mei Ling must have gone through since arriving in Silver Creek. His own life had been tough, but at least he had always been surrounded by people who understood him, who shared his struggles. Mei Ling, on the other hand, was a stranger in a foreign land, a land where she didn't always feel welcome. "I can only imagine what it must have been like for you," Jack said finally, his voice gentle. "Being so far from home with nothing familiar around." Mei Ling smiled faintly, her eyes distant. "At first it was hard, but over time I learned that I couldn't just wait for things to get better. I had to make them better. I had to find a way to survive, to build something that was mine." Jack nodded slowly. He understood that. It was the same way he had lived his life, working hard, doing what needed to be done, never giving up. But there was a difference between surviving and living, between getting by and finding meaning. "You know," Jack said after a moment, "I think that's one of the things I've learned from you. How to slow down a little. Not everything needs to be about just getting through the day. Sometimes it's okay to stop and enjoy things, to notice what's around you." Mei Ling turned to him, her eyes bright. "I'm glad to hear you say that, Jack. It's easy to get lost in work, to forget that life is more than just survival. You've worked hard for so long. Maybe it's time to enjoy the peace that comes with that hard work." Jack leaned back in his chair, thinking about her words. He had never allowed himself to relax, to enjoy the little things. Every day had always been about moving forward, never stopping, never pausing long enough to appreciate what he had. But now, sitting here with Mei Ling, a woman who had come from a world so different from his own, Jack began to see things differently. The ranch wasn't just a place to work, it was a home. The land wasn't just something to survive on, it was something to care for, to protect, to enjoy. "Maybe you're right," Jack said softly. "Maybe it's time I started living, not just surviving." Mei Ling smiled, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a warmth in his chest, a kind of hope he hadn't known in years. He had always been a man who worked hard, but now he was beginning to see that there was more to life than just hard work. There was room for joy, for peace, for companionship. The quiet evening stretched on, with the two of them sitting side by side, drinking tea and watching the stars begin to appear in the sky. The world felt different somehow, softer, more welcoming. For the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He felt instead a quiet sense of contentment, and he realized that in some strange way, his life had already begun to change, and it was all because of the unlikely bond he had formed with a quiet, thoughtful woman from China. The days following that quiet evening on the porch marked the beginning of something new for both Jack and Mei Ling. The ranch, once a place of endless tasks and routine, now felt like a sanctuary. Jack had found a balance between hard work and the peace Mei Ling had encouraged him to embrace. Every morning, as the sun rose over the hills, the two of them would begin their day in the quiet of the early hours, Jack tending to the animals, Mei Ling continuing with her small garden and daily chores. But things had changed. Jack found himself noticing the world around him more, from the warmth of the sun on his back to the way the flowers in Mei Ling's garden had started to bloom. They were little things, but they made all the difference. The two of them had also grown closer, not just as co-workers, but as friends. Jack had never known a person like Mei Ling, someone who could see beyond the surface, who understood him without needing to ask too many questions. She had come into his life as a joke, as part of a prank from his friends, but now she was a person he could trust. She had become someone he could rely on, and in return, he was starting to open up to her in ways he never thought he would. One evening, after a particularly long day working under the sun, Jack and Mei Ling found themselves sitting on the porch again, just like the evening before. This time the stars were brighter, the air cooler. The ranch had settled into a calm rhythm, and Jack felt an unexpected sense of gratitude. He had once believed that a man like him, strong, quiet, and independent, didn't need anyone. But Mei Ling had changed that. "You know," Jack said as he took a long drink from his cup, "when I first met you, I never thought we'd end up here. I thought I'd just do my work, you'd do yours, and we'd go our separate ways eventually." Mei Ling, who had been sitting beside him, her legs tucked beneath her, smiled softly. "I know," she said quietly. "I didn't think I would stay either. I thought I'd just be here for a short time, maybe help out and then move on." Jack turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "But you stayed," he said, his voice carrying a quiet understanding. "And I'm glad you did." Mei Ling looked at him, her dark eyes full of something Jack couldn't quite place. "I stayed because I learned something here," she said slowly. "I came to this country looking for a new life, but I didn't expect to find a place like this, a place where I could belong." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never considered that Mei Ling might be looking for something more than just work. He had always assumed she had come here to escape something or to find a better life. But now he realized she had come looking for peace, for understanding, for a place to call home. "You belong here," Jack said quietly, his words sincere. "You've always belonged here." Mei Ling's smile widened, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Thank you, Jack. That means more than you know." For a moment, they sat in silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Jack had always been a man of few words, but this was different. This wasn't just about work or survival. It was about something deeper. It was about connection, about finding someone who understood him in a way that no one else ever had. Jack finally broke the silence. I think I've been running my whole life. Running from things I didn't want to face and filling the time with work. But I don't want to run anymore. Not from the things that matter, not from the people who matter." Mei Ling looked at him, her expression softening. "You don't have to run anymore, Jack. You've already built something here, a life, a future. You've worked hard for it, and you deserve to enjoy it." Jack looked out over the ranch. The land that had once seemed so vast and overwhelming now felt like something he could hold in his hands. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, not wanting to let anyone in, not wanting to face the emotions that were buried deep inside. But now, with Mei Ling by his side, he felt like he could let those walls come down. "I've Been afraid for a long time, Jack said quietly, his voice low. Afraid of what might happen if I stop working, if I let myself feel something other than the weight of the work. I've always thought that if I stopped, I'd lose everything. Mei Ling's gaze was steady, understanding. You don't lose anything by letting go of fear. You only find more of yourself. And you find that life has so much more to offer than just surviving. Jack looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not just the woman who had come to his ranch as part of a joke, but someone who had changed his life in ways he couldn't have imagined. She had opened his eyes to the world beyond work, beyond survival, to something much more important: connection, peace, and living in the moment. You've changed my life, Jack said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I don't think I could have done it without you. Mei Ling smiled, a warm, gentle smile that made Jack's heart swell. I didn't do anything, Jack. You just had to see it for yourself. You had to allow yourself to believe that there's more to life than just the work. Jack nodded slowly, taking in her words. He had always believed that his value came from what he could do, how much he could work and how hard he could push himself. But now, he understood that there was so much more to life than that. He had learned to live, not just survive. I'm ready for something new, Jack said, his voice steady now, something better. Mei Ling reached over and placed her hand on his, a simple gesture, but one that meant more than words could express. We can build it together, she said, her voice full of quiet certainty. Jack looked out at the horizon, where the sky was beginning to turn dark, the stars just starting to appear. It was a new beginning, not just for him, but for both of them. Together, they had built something more than just a ranch. They had built a life, a future, and a bond that was stronger than anything Jack had ever known. And as the stars twinkled, above them, Jack Tanner finally felt at peace, knowing that he wasn't running anymore. He had found something worth staying for, someone worth living for.